Director of Fire and Emergency Management for senior fire officers back in Limerick about 3 weeks ago, right? And I suppose the reason for giving it today is that every building, whether it's dwellings or commercial industrial buildings, they all are subject to risk of fire. And this is, I suppose, the emergency response considerations in terms of compliance with Part B. I want to make 2 acknowledgements before I do the actual presentation itself. One is to the senior officers within Tipperary Fire and Rescue, and the other one is to the building control officers in the Southern Regional Building Control Group. A lot of the good examples of best practice I'm showing you here have been copied or borrowed from those professionals, and we stand on the shoulders of our colleagues in the other local authorities. So in terms of the actual presentation, I suppose the agenda is around dwelling fires and showing the experience that we are perceiving both here in Ireland and also internationally around dwelling fires. Looking at where house stock has been in Ireland and where it's going, looking at construction trends worldwide, and then looking at some academic literature out there around fire engineering practice and some concerns being raised by some of the subject matter experts. A quick overview of kind of how we approach building control within Tipperary Fire and Rescue Service. We're both the Fire Authority and the Building Control Authority within Tipperary Fire and Rescue. And then some suggestions that are out there really for discussion. And I suppose what I want to do is acknowledge kind of the work the department are doing in terms of the Fire Research Group and also the group inside in Galway in terms of Construct Innovate and the work they're doing. So they're taking on some of the suggestions that we've been going to raise. So firstly, the good news for fire fatalities in Ireland, we're running at about 6 fire fatalities per million per year. And in terms of all the countries around the world, that's best in class. And in context, the US has got about 13 deaths per million per year in 2021. So we've had a huge reduction over the last generation or so in Ireland, okay? The department have been very proactive in terms of actually, particularly dwellings, of improving the standard requirements in terms of buildings, and all new construction since the recent revision of Technical Guidance Document B, Volume 2, requires fire detection alarm in all habitable rooms, LD2 classification. They've also published supplementary guidance in terms of achieving the fire standards for fire-resistant construction in domestic dwellings. And then within the fire service, in conjunction with the National Director of Fire and Emergency Management, we have a very extensive community fire safety programme, which is giving us tangible results in terms of reduced fire fatalities. The NSAI are very active in the whole area, and we've got standards in terms of wood frame construction or timber frame construction, IS 440. And then for other frame constructions, there's agreement certs in place. So it's not a construction methodology that's without any guidance or regulation. I also want to acknowledge the very busy environment that the National Director of Fire and Emergency Management work in. You're probably aware of kind of the industrial action with firefighters last year, and that WRC agreement is still subject to negotiation. We've got this new national mobilisation for the regional control centres being rolled out. We've got an extensive capital programme within the Directorate, and then there's also very extensive work being done in terms of quality inclusion within the fire service. Largely the Irish Fire Service is male orientated, and then the work is now to try and make that more representative actually of the overall community. We've got a validation process that comes in externally to all the fire authorities. We've got follow-up from the Stardust inquiry, and then for the first time we've actually a urban search and rescue capacity being introduced into the country. So there's a very busy work programme there. The other thing I want to do is acknowledge the construction sector. This is a report that was published in 2022, which looked at the actual nature of the construction sector and the capability that's there. And what's interesting is that there's 160,000 employees in early 22 working in the sector, but there was actually 58,000 small and medium enterprises, okay? So the construction sector is made up of very small and medium enterprises. And within Tipperary, our objective as a building control authority is to go along and to foster and encourage those groups. They provide valuable employment to every town and village in the county. They provide support to local sports groups or community groups, okay? And we want them to thrive and prosper. And we see our role within the actual building control sector is working with them in a collaborative manner. So in terms of the presentation, why is this of interest to us as a fire service, okay? And we don't just look internally within Ireland, we also take a look at what's happening internationally. And the NFPA, which is the National Fire Protection Association in the US, publish firefighter fatalities every year. In 2023, unfortunately, there was 89 fatalities, and 40% of those were actually at domestic dwellings, right? And The analysis that the actual NFPA did said is that actually the injuries that they're seeing is a result of structural fires, okay, due to roof and floor collapses, is a reminder that buildings are burning hotter and faster. And that's very reminiscent of the areas to be raised by Walter in terms of actually having scooter fires and battery fires. So we're seeing a change in how buildings are built and the materials inside it, okay? And then in terms of emergency response, firefighters need to consider the fact of premature failure, right, as part of their emergency response. Why is the US data relevant? This is an insurance industry report looking back in 2011 in terms of timber frame construction within the UK and American sector. And you can see in the actual table there that less than 2% of dwellings in England and Wales were timber framed back in 2011, 10% in Scotland, and over 90% of dwellings were timber framed in the US. And on the right-hand side there, you can look to see where sprinkler provisions are required in the US, but the codes back in 2011 had no requirement for any sprinkler protection in the UK. What's also happening in the States is some of the actual fire services are becoming quite proactive in terms of actually informing their firefighter response to framed construction firefighting. And the Phoenix Fire Department has been to the forefront here, working with the National Institute of Standards and Technology and doing testing not to demonstrate performance, but demonstrate how the actual framed construction dwellings respond to a point of collapse. And what they're finding is that actually that some of the actual frame construction will collapse in 17 or 8 minutes. And the analysis that they're saying is that actually the collapse times may be dangerously and deceptively high, even from that testing, all right? So that's obviously an issue for ourselves as we look forward in Ireland, right? And again, the link is to the publication at the bottom of the slide there. So in terms of leading indicators of this side of the water, we've had some indications that maybe frame construction is behaving differently than what we call the traditional construction. We had a fire in Offaly back in 2019, 2020, where a timber frame structure essentially collapsed and injured a firefighter in the gable wall, perhaps prematurely, and that's on the top left there. We've had the Milford Manor estate fire back in 2015, where essentially there was a terrace of houses, and despite the fire service being on scene within 10 minutes of the emergency service being called, were unable to save the actual terrace of houses. And finally, not a fire-based emergency, but the Edinburgh school wall collapse, where again frame construction and in a high winds condition, the actual wall collapsed. So we do have evidence to show that frame construction is behaving differently than we would hope to achieve. In terms of building age profiles, there's a report published back in 2020 looked at the long-term renovation strategy, and that flagged the actual age profile of dwellings in Ireland, about 1.1 million up as far as 2000, and through the Celtic Tiber then we actually had a 70% increase to about 1.7 million dwellings. But the dwellings that were built pre-2000 were traditional buildings, so they were all masonry construction and cut timber joists. And again, what I've shown here are some pictures representing the substantial nature of the actual timber-based construction that was in the houses that were built pre-2000. And in terms of actually fires in those dwellings, they behaved in a very predictable manner, whilst the actual habitable areas within the actual dwellings were totally destroyed. You can see the pictures where the actual building stood strong despite the actual total consumption of the actual fire. And what's interesting is if you look at a terraced house on the right-hand side, the fire stayed within a terrace, unlike what happened inside the Milford Manor, where the whole terrace was lost. Since the downturn, we've started to rebuild again, right? And we've built about 170,000 houses according to CSO between 2016 and 2024. And the breakdown is there in a chart between apartments, housing schemes, housing estates, and single houses. And in round terms, we've got about 20% are single houses, okay, and about 40% are apartments and schemes. Schemes and apartments are subject to certain compliance completion, and we've talked about that in terms of some of the presentations earlier. But the one-off dwellings we see in Tipperary are largely opt-outs. So where are we going in terms of housing construction is a big political topic right now. The Housing Commission report is saying we're going to build somewhere between 50 and 60,000. They came up with a number of 57,000, okay? If we roll those numbers out, we're looking at dwellings being about 2.6 million, up from kind of 1.1 million in 2000, right? So we're seeing a substantial increase in terms of actually dwellings in Ireland, okay? And a lot of those dwellings will be frame-based construction. In terms of worldwide trends, there's only one way it's going. There's actually the population increasing worldwide. The actual global building stock is expected to increase like we're seeing in Ireland, okay? But what's also happening is the UN is actually requiring that actually not alone are the buildings net operational carbon, but also net embodied carbon as well. And their target is that by 2050, there will be net zero embodied carbon in new buildings, okay? The report of the Housing Commission is flagging that actually Irish construction needs to move more towards using timber frame construction. And what's interesting is Scotland is already there. Back in 2023, 95% of housing estates were actually timber frame construction in Scotland. What's also interesting is the large consultancies that are doing tall and complex buildings are embracing this requirement to reduce embodied carbon. And Arabs, who've actually would be considered one of the leaders in terms of complex and high-rise construction, have published a fire-safe design of mass timber buildings. And this will be essentially GLT, CLT timber systems, okay? And what they're saying is that their designs right now will work towards a net zero by 2050, but a 40% reduction by 2030 in terms of actually the buildings that they're involved in, okay? But what's interesting is the scale of their ambition. They're looking at 50 metres for residential and business use and 25 metres for educational use. So we're looking at 17-storey buildings for education or for residential and business, and up to 8-storey buildings for educational as timber-based construction, okay? But what's also interesting is that guide is actually for CLT, GLT, it's not for lightweight timber construction. When you take a read of the actual guide itself, right, they actually segregate the buildings into low-rise, medium-rise and high-rise, okay? And looking at what they consider low-rise is less than 12 metres, which would be a 4 or 5-storey building, okay? And their approach is that actually firefighting should be external or else from protected stairs. So our standard approach to doing search and rescue in our old traditional masonry buildings, the designers are now saying, we don't see that as actually the way forward in terms of actually the firefighting within buildings. And that talks to some of the changes that we're talking about, making sure people can get out of buildings. So the change that we're seeing kind of within Tipperary and right around Ireland, okay, is that IS 440 for timber frame construction is happening. The actual frame units are coming in on transport, okay. We're seeing a lot of metal web joists, okay. And then we're seeing a lot of services running in those joists, right? And so designers are putting in a lot more mechanelec within the actual, what we call traditional buildings, dwellings. So the regulatory environment kind of that actually ourselves and the actual industry are trying to achieve is actually the functional requirements in B8, which is equivalent to B3 in technical guidance document B for non-commercial or for commercial, is that the dwelling house should be so designed and constructed that the event of a fire, its stability will be maintained for a reasonable period, okay? And the way that's achieved with frame construction is that we use frame fire-resistant construction, okay, and adequate fire stopping around the openings, okay? And the standard approach in Ireland, in Europe and worldwide is that we do standard tests, okay? And the standard tests come up with actually a methodology to go along and give you a classification for the build-up in terms of resistance to collapse, resistance to fire penetration, and resistance to excessive heat. And that's a worldwide approach. It's not just something that's within Ireland or within Europe, okay? But there's caveats coming out there, all right? And there is some academic research out there that's actually beginning to challenge this approach. The first questions were asked back as early as 1981, where Margaret Law, who's actually passed away, actually presented a paper in New York around some concerns with regards to standard fire tests. And what she was postulating, and this was for steel and masonry construction, was that the actual fire testing was unrealistic and contradicts available knowledge of fire dynamics. She was saying it was open to criticism in terms of the duration, okay? And she was saying the actual loading and conditions of the standard test cannot represent the continuity, restraint and distribution of real buildings, okay? And then the structural properties of test specimens are not well defined. So concerns raised over 40 years ago at this stage. There's actually a viewpoint in the last 10 years, okay, that's actually beginning to go along and concur with what you raised as a concern back in 1981. And what some of the academic papers are now saying is that the structural fire engineering community is at a difficult situation, and that the standard fire test has become the performance objective rather than the actual taking into account the real fire risks and the consequent fire failures, right? And what some of the papers are beginning to say is that the structural fire engineering community are only just beginning to truly wrestle with a true response of real structures to real fires. On top of that, there's a voluntary group that's run under the auspices of the Institute of Institute of Structural Engineering and Civil Engineers in the UK, and it's called the Collaborative Reporting for Safer Structures. And essentially, they have this concept of a reporter, and a reporter is a chartered engineer. And if he or she is working in a project and has got a concern with regards to the way in which fire engineering is done, they can write up the basis of their concerns. That report is sent on to a peer review committee, and if they feel those concerns are warranted, okay, they'll publish that on the CROSS website. Now, the CROSS website is not just a UK body at this stage, there's also CROSS equivalents in Canada, Australia, and in the US, okay? So in terms of light gauge steel structures, which is framed construction, steel rather than timber, okay, one of the actual reports talks to the concern that actually was given back to the reporter, to the chartered engineer from the developer. And the developer was saying was, okay, I'm justifying one side of testing it being provided because the test houses only test on one side, all right, which is true, okay? But the reporter was of the mind that the constraint in testing is not a reasonable defence, given the consequence of actually premature failure. And what the actual peer review report that was published went along and said, for fire and rescue services, if you've got structures that don't have all-around testing, that are manufactured or erected out of light gauge steel, response agencies, fire response agencies need to be aware and take into account in terms of their response that actually premature collapse may be actually a real concern. So this is all around dwelling fires, but take it into account that actually a lot of frame construction is happening in commercial and industrial and guest-based accommodation. So whilst the actual presentation was made around dwelling fires, because that's primarily where we see fatalities in Ireland in terms of the fire service, okay, a lot of the points I'm making are actually just as viable and of interest for frame construction with any building. So as I mentioned earlier, Tipperary Fire and Rescue Service are a fire authority as well as a building authority. To give you a feel of the activity levels, we had 554 buildings in 2023, of which 465 were actually domestic dwellings, and about half of those were actually frame construction, timber frame or light gauge steel. And in 2023 we carried out 178 inspections, and mainly focusing on housing estates in terms of our approach. And it's very obvious we're seeing the move from masonry to frame construction over the last 5 years. As fire officers going out, we're primarily focused on kind of Part B compliance, okay, and we're looking around, particularly in frame construction, cavity barriers and protection of fire opening and fire stopping, given the concerns that are being raised. We take an approach to go along and take credit for the good work to be done by NSAI around recertification audits or for IS 440 and for the agreement certs. So that takes care of the factory design, the factory production, the actual shipment to site. And we're really focused on education on site, commencement notices, inspections, and then certs and compliance and completion as a building control authority. In terms of education, we've actually done a bit of awareness training around fire resistance versus fire reaction, because again, we found some of the trades were actually not well attuned to that. We have a webinar link there on the actual page below. And what we've done is try to go along and explain to people the requirements for 60 minutes, 30 minutes, modified 30 minutes within dwelling fires. That these are real requirements to make sure people can actually get out. And we've also gone along and actually translated some of the actual and supplementary guidance into consolidated guidance for different dwelling types, from a bungalow the whole way as far as a two-storey dormer. And again, just want to acknowledge Martin Moore, Assistant Chief Fire Officer, who pulled together the actual diagrams down below. And again, if you go to that webinar link that's on the slide there, you'll see all that support documentation. We go along and we do inspections. We tell people we're going to come out. We give them the good news that they're going to have the opportunity to tell us how good they are. We flag problems that we see routinely in terms of both non-compliance from Part A to Part M. But we also go along and flag to them that when you're doing certs and compliance completion in Tipperary, you need to hand in 6 pieces of documentation for each dwelling. So we ask for the Fire Detection Alarm System Annex K certification. We ask for the ventilation validation certification. We ask for the Safe Electric Ireland completion cert, the sound testing certification, the air tightness test report, and the BER report. All right, and that's per dwelling. All right, so there's a good bit of documentation coming in for maybe a 20 house estate. In terms of inspection reports or inspection plans, we're finding they're doing it in terms of code of practice. And again, the code of practice for dwellings is quite simple. It's a 5 or 6 page step inspection routine. But some of the better contractors now are coming up with what they call a design responsibility matrix. And they're flagging who's doing what, particularly around fire stopping, and taking responsibility either for the frame manufacturers doing it or the actual contractors doing it. And you can see an example there on the right-hand side where I've actually had the top, the actual party wall has been done by the frame manufacturer, and then the gable ends and the actual cavity barriers around the actual windows are being done by the actual main contractor. But that's clearly been indicated up front as part of the inspection plan. We're also finding some of the contractors are now using cloud-based technology. So we go out to the site and 10 houses are actually at second fix with the roof on. And we said to them, can you show us evidence that actually where those houses were actually before you closed up, okay? They're able to pull up on house number 4, pictures of the actual roof and the actual cavity barriers and the actual stopping in the party wall, the separation that's required under IS 440 between the air gap between the actual dwellings, and then the actual the build-up before they actually framed off the party wall internally on the top right there. This is again showing some pictures they have on their cloud-based apps for the fire stopping and cavity barriers around windows at the gable end and also at the actual top of the external walls, and also showing pictures of wall ties. So they're becoming more evidence-based. Not all contractors, but some of the better ones. We're also finding, and again it was subject to kind of some of the actual discussions earlier by Connell, we're seeing a lot of actually supplementary design cert CS and CSS certifications coming in, right? This is for a 20 housing estate that came in, okay? And we got in a total of 15 different supplementary certs from there, okay? And we're getting in those on top of the actual 6 documents that we require per dwelling for each of the actual 20 houses. So we're seeing quite a deal of evidence of good quality work coming at us from these housing estates. So where does that leave us in terms of a response agency, which is really the group that I was talking to down below in Limerick 3 weeks ago? And what I was suggesting to people was that about by 2040, somewhere between 33% and 50% of actually dwellings that we are doing an emergency response to dwelling fires will be frame construction. And in the US, they're telling us that actually premature collapse is a possibility. And they're also saying that actually using thermal imaging cameras is not a good predictor of actually when the collapse would happen. So in terms of technical guidance document B, section 0.1 talks about actually the guidance document is protection of life. And one of the things as a fire authority is that we have got statutory responsibility for the safety of firefighters that are making a fire response to a fire in that dwelling. So in terms of the actual premature collapse, that's a statutory responsibility of the response agencies in terms of the firefighters responding. And then in section 5, it talks about protection of life and property, right? So they're the requirements that are in the actual guidance document. But there's evidence is out there that early collapse is a real possibility. And the question I was asking senior officers back in Limerick 3 weeks ago was, should the Irish Fire Service be doing more to advocate for the firefighters who will be responding by 2040? And the reason I'm doing that is in the context of 2 items. One is the actual premature collapse here of the dwellings in Binford Manor in Kildare about 7 years ago. And the other one is the actual recruits class in Dublin Fire Brigade in 2018. Those young men and women, okay, are just starting their career at this stage. They'll still be fighting fires by 2040. And what should we be thinking about in terms of making their life more safe as they respond to the emergency calls that we're getting from the general public? So I'm giving these as suggestions, and it's really to go along and actually open up discussions. They're not recommendations coming from Tipperary Fire Service or from the fire authorities around Ireland, okay? And one of the areas that we need to do is actually for firefighters, we do a lot of training in terms of actual orientation, and BA stands for breathing apparatus, CFBT stands for compartment fire behaviour training, and looking at how firefighters respond to fires and making them aware that actually frame construction may respond differently than the houses that were pre-2000, okay? And then our command courses need to also take that into account, because early collapse is a real possibility. The other one is that actually Phoenix Fire Service in the States have used as being an early adopter of doing testing, not to show how good the actual building is, but testing it to destruction, showing actually what possibly can happen. And maybe there's an opportunity to work with the actual other fire services around Europe to use some of the test houses either in Paris or that's been used by the Phoenix Fire Service in the US to do large-scale testing of actually dwellings and see how they actually respond. The other item that we're seeing kind of on our side as a building control authority is there's lots of statutory registers and documentation coming at us through the guidance document around the RGI certs, the fire detection alarm systems, the ventilation validation, sound testing, recce certs, air tightness certs, BER certs. And should we be going along, particularly around frame construction, and be looking for supplementary guidance out to the industry in terms of how people specify, procure, install and verify cavity barriers and fire stopping, particularly around frame construction? And should we be looking for that as a plan at a commencement notice stage and then looking for verification at completion stage? Again, an item for discussion with the frame manufacturing sector. The other issue is that some of the contractors are addressing cloud-based technology. And what I was saying to the fire service was that, you know, over the last 10 years, we've gone through a huge transition moving away from paper onto cloud-based systems for doing checks on our life-critical systems around water rescue, appliances, breathing apparatus, and they're the pictures of the tablets that we use locally within Tipperary. But should we have that expectation that all sites that are building residential-based construction have that cloud-based technology and they're keeping evidential records per house that they can submit? The last point, which again has been talked to in terms of B12, or is it B11 in terms of the B12 on the revised technical guidance document B, which is owner information, okay? When it comes to dwelling houses, okay, there's a poor understanding out there in terms of the trade community and the owners that actually a frame construction dwelling is different than a masonry dwelling. And you can have unanticipated or unintended diminution of the build integrity, either through maintenance, through alterations, through extensions, okay, that can have a very detrimental effect in terms of fire safety. And what we're suggesting maybe to consider is that there would be a QR code on the actual meter box to go along and be there as a resource for both the owner and the tradespeople to say, this is this dwelling, here are the characteristics, and here's what you need to be aware when you're maintaining, altering or extending this building itself. And the final suggestion is my own, right, kind of is based on a course that I did back during COVID, which was actually a certificate in enforcement in public bodies run by the Law Society. And one of the lecturers on the course was actually a guy called Kieran Walker, who works in the whole area of financial regulation. And he was looking at regulation and looking at a way in which the public respond to regulation. So when something goes wrong, whether it's in the building sector, whether it's in the healthcare sector, and the educational sector, the public and the political responses, we need more inspectors, all right? And the Edinburgh Wall collapse, lack of scrutiny, all right? But what they're beginning to find in the financial services sector is, okay, that the evidence suggests there is a limitation to the extent to which greater compliance can be achieved by increasing fines and the probability of detection. And what they're switching to is actually behavioural economics. All right, looking at actually changing the drivers for the perception of actually detection and punishment, looking at actually debiasing both the individual and firm's decisions around risk taking. All right, rebalancing the actual the role of morality in terms of when you're making decisions. Okay, and then looking at culture. And I suppose the question I had for both the senior fire officers in Limerick and for the industry and a wider perspective is, okay, should we be looking at behavioural economics? And looking at actually trying to go and change the culture and looking at the roles of morality and risk-taking as we move forward in terms of it. So I'm going to finish going back to the very, very start, which is actually that the building regulations are all about functional requirements to provide for the health, safety and welfare and accessibility of people in and around sustainable buildings. Nobody argues with that. There's lots of stakeholders out there, you know, the fire authorities, the building control authorities, designers, builders, owners, assigned certifiers. Our objective within Tipperary is to work on a collaborative basis and to go back to the Gilga, Nínearc, Curl, Kayla,